From the studios of Farm Journal Broadcast, this is AgDay.
It can happen in an instant.
So it only takes a few seconds to get in that flow and you almost go to the floor.
How flowing grain 1 minute can turn into a death trap the next. As we continue our series, Close Calls, Stories of Survival. The U.S. dollar continues to gain strength.
I think there's some big implications there, possibly for exports.
How that could factor into exports as the Gulf Coast readies for what could possibly be its first hurricane of the season.
We have a considerable amount of citrus exposed to potential harm.
The latest on the possible trek and impact right now on AgDay. Good morning, I'm Clinton Griffiths. Happening right now, all eyes on the potential of a hurricane hitting the Gulf Coast later this week. It's the first hurricane threat of the year so far for the Gulf area. The National Hurricane Center on Friday putting the area of concern from the eastern Gulf to east of the Florida Peninsula, with winds arriving as early as tomorrow morning. For market watchers, the concern is over the possibility of supply disruptions, especially when it comes to oil and natural gas. Right now, natural gas stocks are tight, and if the storm tracks further west along the Texas coast, that could take plants offline for a time. It would be the same issue for oil refineries up and down the Texas and Louisiana coast. But on Friday, crude oil slumped below $80 for the first time since early January. If Florida remains in the bullseye, OJ prices have the potential to see a rally, with USDA saying the state's orange production is already down 22% from last season.
Fruits are sizing up. Oranges generally the size of tennis balls to baseballs. We have grapefruits that are considerably larger, the size of softballs or larger. Those fruits, largely not yet ready to harvest, can be stripped from the trees in times of high winds and left in standing water to spoil. We saw this, unfortunately, during the hurricanes in 2004 and 2005 on a very large scale.
Of course, this isn't just a possible issue for the Gulf Coast. Once it makes landfall, further impacts could be felt, including wind and heavy rains in the southeast and northeast, which could impact Georgia's cotton crop, where 1.5 to 2/3 of the cotton bolls are now open. Meteorologist Matt Yurosavik is also continuing to track the potential of a hurricane hitting the Gulf Coast. He joins us with an update. Matt.
That's right, Clinton. Watching some tropical trouble in the Gulf heading towards the East Coast, and that could bring a lot of rainfall there. Taking a look at that rainfall or precipitation possible over the next week, and we're looking at a lot going on in the southeast, parts of the Gulf Coast, especially in Florida, and that is with that storm moving on through. And by Monday afternoon and evening, it will start to move closer to the Florida Peninsula, but there is a storm system still exiting off the northeast, and that's still going to keep some unsettled weather for parts of the Great Lakes and the interior portions of New England. Much of the rest of the country, though, will be sunny and warm, and it's going to be hot again in parts of the south and west, and that's because we've got a big ridge continuing to build off in the west. And this kind of westerly flow or northwesterly flow through the Great Lakes and into the northeast is going to keep things very seasonable, more fall-like there heading through this week, with temperatures in the 60s and 70s for most. But then it gets milder as that storm slowly moves up the east coast, bringing more unsettled weather through early next week. And great to see harvest getting underway for many right now. Justin Campbell of Terre Haute, Indiana, snapping this photo of the corn harvest in full swing. Looks like a picture-perfect day, too. I'll have more on your forecast coming up.
We're also continuing to follow the dominance of the U.S. dollar, the British pound, the euro, and the Swiss franc, all falling against the greenback again as investors seek out a safe haven, pushing the dollar to another 20-year high in early trading on Friday. Risky assets, including stocks, continue to slide to the end of the week. It followed recent moves by central banks in several countries, including the U.S., to raise interest rates to combat inflation. Analysts watching to see how this will impact ag exports.
I want to point out exports too. We got to go back to remembering that currency really matters. And that, I think, is a big concern as we look at South Korea, Japan, and their currency relative to the US dollar. I think there's some big implications there possibly for exports, and we're starting to see some of that play out in the data as well.
CNBC reports $1 US will now buy you the greatest amount of Japanese yen since the early 1990s. Last week, the country intervened in the currency market for the first time since 1998 after the yen fell to 24-year lows against the US dollar. U.S. food price inflation is now predicted to be the highest since 1974. USDA releasing its latest consumer price index predicting all food prices to be up 9 to 10%, with food bought at the grocery store up 10.5 to 11.5%. Now, egg prices, they're leading the way as far as increases go. Cereal and baking products are also up. Forecasters say ongoing supply chain issues, energy prices, along with transportation and labor costs, have all contributed to the price increases. Federal prosecutors are recommending a cattleman spend at least 10 years in prison following a so-called ghost cattle scheme. Now, we've been keeping you updated on the case of Cody Easterday of Washington State. He was accused of charging for the costs of buying and feeding as many as 200,000 cattle that simply did not exist. Now, it's reported the scheme cost Tyson Fresh Meats and another victim at least $244 million. Now, last year, Easterday pleaded guilty to 1 count of wire fraud. The Justice Department attorneys filed a memo in court calling the theft staggering. Now, they recommended Easterday serve between 121 and 151 months or up to 12 years and 7 months behind bars. Easterday's sentencing has been delayed 3 times to allow his legal team to sort out what the judge has described as a mess in terms of personal financial issues. He's now due to be sentenced at the beginning of October.
Close Calls, Stories of Survival on AgDay is brought to you by AGI. AGI offers complete systems and solutions with industry-leading products to meet your needs. AGI has you covered. To learn more, visit aggrowth.com.
Over the last several decades, hundreds of injuries and deaths have occurred in grain bins across the country due to engulfment. Few farmers realize the hazards from flowing grain, which include entrapment and suffocation. AgDay's Michelle Rook takes a look at some of the hazards as part of our series Close Calls, Stories of Survival.
A grain bin engulfment can happen in the blink of an eye and cause serious injury or suffocation, resulting in death. Purdue Ag Safety expert Bill Field says flowing grain entrapments fall into 4 primary categories. The first is engulfment in a flowing column of grain.
Most common is they're in there when the grain's flowing. They're trying to scrape the walls off or break up crusted grain, and they get too close to the center. And that center's moving at about the same volume or capacity as the auger that's emptying the bin. So it only takes a few seconds to get in that flow and you almost go to the floor.
The second is the collapse of a horizontal crusted grain surface. Now, this happens when grain spoils and forms a crust. Field says it can become so compacted it can be walked on, and farmers often enter the bin to break it up.
When they go in that crusted grain and there's a surface on the grain, and we mentioned that is that grain surface will become very compact and you can walk on it and they may not realize that there's a void underneath or a hot spot, and that breaks through and ends up getting pulled into the flow of grain and trapped.
The third is the collapse of a vertical crusted grain surface. Now, Field says this is where spoiled or caked grain stands in almost a vertical column. This can also occur inside a bin where spoiled grain is clinging to the bin walls.
Standing there in the middle of a bin, and the farmers will go in there and try to break it up from the base. And if it collapses, it often will just bury the farmer.
And the final hazard is entrapment or suffocation in grain transport vehicles. Now, this includes grain carts, wagons, and trucks, and often occurs during the unloading operation.
People have been caught in truckloads of grain while they were trying to break them free. And if the corn or beans or whatever it is wet, it'll seal up overnight and becomes very difficult to empty.
Remember, it only takes 4 or 5 seconds for a farmer who enters a grain bin with the unloader running to be submerged to the point of becoming helpless. And Field says it takes less than 20 seconds to be completely submerged in flowing grain.
All right, thanks, Michelle. Purdue University taking a look at safety on the farm as part of National Farm Safety. and Health Week releasing its annual Indiana Farm Fatality Summary. Now, it reports there were 20 work-related on-farm deaths just in Indiana last year. The researchers say tractors were the most common agent in those deaths, representing as many as 52% of documented cases over the past 10 years. 6 alone were reported last year. Other causes include grain entrapment, being run over by equipment, along with entanglements and asphyxiation by fumes in confined spaces. The good news in all of this is that 2021 marked a decrease from the 25 deaths reported in 2020, and it marks the fewest cases reported in the past 8 years. And a scary situation unfolded last week in Delphi, Indiana, after a major grain bin collapsed at the Anderson grain facility. The good news here, no injuries or deaths. Reports are there was a fire at the facility earlier in the day. A soybean bin and several conveyors also had damage. Now, the cause of the collapse is under investigation. Market slumped last week. What will it take to turn things around? We'll have more coming up next. And later, when did you start loving certain veggies while hating others? It may have started earlier than you think in the country. There was red across the board to end last week after a surging dollar and increasing recession fears pressured the markets. Michelle Rook has more on if the market sees better news ahead this week.
Joining us with market analysis, Jim McCormick with AgMarket.net. A tough down week, especially Friday last week in the commodities sector. A lot of it was spillover from recessionary fears, risk off. When does the bleeding in these macroeconomic markets, when does that stop, Jim?
Unfortunately, Michelle, I think we've got some more pain to go. The reality is the world's trying to reset itself on these high inflationary numbers. All the central banks around the world are raising their interest rates. That's as they're trying to get this genie of inflation back into the bottle. And the reality is when they do that, it is slowing down the world's economy. As the world's economy slows down, the demand is going to drop. And that is why you're seeing weakness essentially in the equity market as well as spilling over into the commodity sector. Unfortunately, I don't think we're there yet. I mean, there's a lot of talk that interest rates got to get to 4.5% minimum here by the end of the year. So if you're looking at that, it's just hard to see, the macro picture stabilizing anytime soon. I think you will get bounces, but those bounces probably will be sold near term.
And of course, it's pushing the dollar into new highs, which is also something that pressures these commodities.
Well, exactly. As essentially as they start raising interest rates, it is attracting all sorts of money into the United States right now. There's some economic policies that the British did last week that the world did not like, driving the British pound to lows that we haven't seen since 1985. That just pushed more money into the U.S. dollar.
Right.
As the dollar gets more expensive, we're not competitive. The reality is right now, world buyers can buy beans cheaper than us from South America. They can buy corn cheaper from us out of Europe, and they can buy wheat cheaper than we're selling it out of Europe as well. And that's a problem, and the higher dollar just makes it us that much less uncompetitive.
Plus, it's a money flow game, you and I know, and so that's going to kind of continue to keep pressing these commodities.
I think right now it is. I mean, the real question right now is we saw a lot of money come back. We saw money come into commodities early in the year, then it exited the commodities early in the inflation fight. Then we saw a little bit of money come back in, at least in some of these ags on the tighter supply situation. Right. The question now is that money going to stay with those ag positions based on the tighter micro situation? The projected corn carryout of 1.2 billion. There's not a lot of room for error. Or are they just going to push that money right back out again as they're fearful of fighting the Fed, as we like to say?
Yeah, and the funds always push this farther than they need to. Thanks so much, Jim McCormick, joining us with AgMarket.net. More Ag Day coming up.
To contact Jim McCormick at Ag Market, call 844-4AG-MARKET or visit their website at www.agmarket.net.
Meteorologist Matt Yurosavik joining us here, taking a look at our drought monitor. Matt, we've seen some changes here, some improvements, some places, start to show up with different colors on the map. But overall, where do we sit as far as drought goes?
Well, over the past couple of weeks, we've actually stayed pretty much the same with regards to coverage of the drought. It has improved a little bit with severity of the drought in parts of the Southwest. We're expecting more rain there this week, and also in parts of the East, expecting more rain from this hurricane. And you can see still very, very dry across the middle part of the country, back in places like Utah, Nevada, even central California, still dealing with extreme to exceptional drought conditions. and that's going to stay the same. Not a whole lot of precipitation expected there in the west as we head through this week, but a lot more rain coming for parts of the East Coast as we're watching this storm kind of move very slowly and what could be up the East Coast, maybe all the way up the East Coast. So something we got to continue to keep an eye on there, but likely going to see some improvements maybe in this area right here, right around the Four Corners region, maybe some of Utah, some parts of northern Arizona, New Mexico as well. Could see a little bit more rain, some scattered shower and thunderstorm activity there. Most of the country, though, below normal, except for the southeast, Gulf Coast there, parts of Florida, maybe even up into the Carolinas as we're watching a lot of rainfall from this tropical system. And if we look at the precipitation this week, not a whole lot going on, but you can see where the bullseye is for all that rain down in Florida and starting to inch its way up the East Coast towards the end of the week, and just some scattered showers and storms back in parts of the Southwest. Still going to be warm back there as well, much above normal temperatures this week, but really from the Mississippi on to the West Coast, temperatures going to be above average and then cooler than normal here in parts of the Mid-South up into the Northeast, and warmer than normal behind that system that will eventually move on out. Next week's going to be much of the same, still looking at above normal precipitation in the southeast and back in the Four Corners, and then temperature is going to stay above normal for most of the country, even as we head through next week, staying near normal though from the parts of Georgia and South Carolina all the way up the Northeast. But again, still watching most of the country be under this ridge and experience above normal temperatures all the way through the end of September and into the beginning of October. That's a look around the country. Now let's take a look at the weather where you live. Jamestown, New York, showers likely, a high near 59 degrees. Heading to Howard, Kansas, sunny and warm, a high of 80 degrees. And in Pasco, Washington, sunny and warm, a high near 82.
Have you gone to any farm shows lately? Machinery Pete sure has, and he's been kicking the tires on some cool new equipment. Next.
Got equipment to sell privately but tired of scams and hassles? Visit machinerypete.com and click Sell Mine. MachineryPete.com, the simple and secure way to buy and sell equipment online.
Farm shows are back, and that means Machinery Pete is back at it. This week, checking out gravity wagons.
Well, it's great to have farm shows back as in-person events. Great to get out and look at all the shiny new equipment. I always love the people aspect, the people you run into and the conversations you have. Now, last week out in Ohio, the Farm Science Review celebrated their 60th anniversary farm show. Fantastic event out there. And again, great fun to go look at all the shiny new equipment. But I tell you, one of the exhibitors at the show, our friends at J&M Manufacturing, did something very cool. In their exhibit, they had this item on display, which was a restored 1960 wagon they made, one of the very first gravity wagons J&M made. And I know that was turning a lot of heads at the show. And they did a great social media post where they included a picture of the wagon out in the field from back in the day, 60 plus years ago, and actually a picture of the original owner's manual, so very cool there. Now if we shift focus to gravity wagons today, of course used values have been rising, auction prices very strong. Here's a picture of a J&M 540, and gravity wagons have got quite a bit bigger over the years, but this 540 sold on a farm auction August 30th in Bern, Indiana, and it sold for $13,700. Now, if you go to our machinerypete.com website, check out all our auction prices, you would find that $13,700 is the highest auction price ever on a J&M 540, and in fact, it just beat the previous record, which was set just a couple months ago, back on June 9th, on a farm auction in Rosebush, Michigan. Here's a picture of it, and that one sold for $13,000.
Still ahead, what's your favorite veggie? You may have figured it out even before you were born. Details next.
Closed captioning on AgDay is brought to you by BASF. BASF, helping you do the biggest jobs on earth.
Have you ever wondered when you developed a taste for some foods and started not liking others? Well, one study claims it all happened even before you were born. Scientists at Durham University in the UK gave 100 pregnant women either a carrot pill, a kale pill, or a plain pill, and then took an image of their fetuses 20 minutes later to see the reaction. Now, they claim the sweet carrot flavor got more smiles, what they call a laughter face. Yes, they say they could actually see this on the 4D ultrasound. And the bitter kale, some frowns, like a cry face. The researchers are hoping to learn if tweaking a pregnant woman's diet could help promote healthy eating habits later in life for children. Now, they say the next step is to see how the babies in the study react to each food once they try it themselves, and to expand the study to women of different races and cultures. Interesting stuff, and that's all the time we have this morning. We're sure glad you tuned in. From all of us here at AgDay, I'm Clinton Griffiths. Have a great day.